Primeval was an ITV drama series first airing in 2007, following a team of assorted professionals as they handled prehistoric wildlife that came through spatio-temporal fault lines, called anomalies, to the modern day. Its lead Douglas Henshall describes it as the A-Team with monsters. Its first series ran for 6 episodes and didn't actually feature a single dinosaur, although it had a handful of other reptile species from the Mesozoic, as well as some giant bugs, a giant therapsid, and a predatory future bat. So let's explore the who's, what's and why's of Primeval's first series. This video will have full spoilers for Season 1, but not for future ones, in case this is how anyone actually discovers the programme. The series and Episode 1 opens with an Asda car park. A lot of the charm of the series is the prehistoric clashing with the mundane of noughties England. Electromagnetic interference appears to play on the scene, dragging shopping trolleys and flickering lights, and a giant therapsid emerges from the shadows. Its target, an unknown woman, flees ahead. With the staff inside ignoring her cries for help and the monster behind her tossing cars and trolleys, she flees into the forest as the titles roll. 8 years later, we meet several of our main protagonists at the Central Metropolitan University where they work and study. Nick Cutter, a professor of evolutionary zoology, his lab assistant Stephen Hart, and one of his dissertation students, Connor Temple. We find out that, passionate as he is, Cutter maybe isn't the best lecturer, not turning up for his own seminars, although Connor maybe isn't the best student, with a pretty far-fetched idea of his dissertation that Cutter bins. Cutter's actor Douglas Henshall describes him as a career scientist rather than a teacher, there for the love of his job and the discoveries that come with it. Cutter explains his own passions to Connor, for Lazarus taxa and living fossils and blank spots in evolution and the paleontological records. And Connor, in response, shows him a blurry CCTV picture from a tabloid newspaper. Cutter tells him to touch grass, and after exposing himself as a conspiracy theorist, Connor also claims Cutter's wife Helen wouldn't have ignored it. This does reach Cutter, but doesn't persuade him, until Connor plays his ace and reveals it was in the Forest of Dean. Meanwhile, at Wellington Zoo, we meet Abby Maitland, trying to goad a pair of sailfin lizards into mating. Abby's boss and zoo director Tim Parker shows up with bad news, and with a loss in funding, Abby's role in the reptile house has been cut. But she perks up when she sees a weird and unknown lizard that a member of the public has acquired, and offers to find both the lizard and accepts a role in the bug house instead. At an industrial site on the borders of the forest, Cutter, Stephen and Connor investigate the sighting. A livestock lorry full of poultry has been torn open, and a cast-iron gate flattened. Stephen fills Connor and the audience in that Nick's wife Helen went missing in this area 8 years ago, with no trace other than a rucksack, and was the woman in the opening. Abby meets the caller, and meets Ben and Rex too. Ben initially claims Rex is a Draco volans, a Southeast Asian gliding lizard, but Abby rightly thinks otherwise. For a start, he's massive, about the size of an iguana, whereas Draco volans are about the size of a hand. The two enter the forest to retrace Ben's steps as to where he found Rex. Instead, they find a cow stashed up a tree, and are both unnerved by a distant roar. Ben panics and flees, leaving Abby behind as she carries Rex. On the other side of the forest, Cutter decides to sink a quick pint, and meets Claudia Brown from the Home Office, hoping that he can dismiss the CCTV photo as a hoax so she can go home. Nick believes if it's anything, it's probably a big cat, but invites her to join the group anyway. In the forest, Abby trips and lets go of Rex, who proves he isn't indeed a Draco volans when he takes flight. Canonically, Rex is a Coelurosaurus, an ancient reptile from late Permian Madagascar, that also had a similar structure on the ribcage to facilitate gliding. Whilst Primeval's Coelurosaurus can achieve true flight, both the real one and Draco volans could only glide. Fossil evidence suggests they actually did so in the same way, partially unfurling their rib gliders and hooking them onto their fingers to form a composite wing, for better support and stability as they glided. But Primeval's creatures are often massive and weird, especially its therapsid, and as Abby retrieves Rex, the two hide as they see the reflection of the huge predator pass them by. Meanwhile, Ben is the first one to see what the series later terms as an anomaly, appearing like a suspended detonation of broken glass shimmering in the air. He sticks his head through and sees a hot volcanic landscape, with plenty more of Rex's kind flying around. Cutter and his team have entered the forest, and start down the same path as Abby and Ben do, also finding the cow as the multiple groups begin to converge. Ben has split from the main group though, and as can so often happen, is isolated by the predator. The giant therapsid tracks his scent and follows him home, smashing its head through the window frame to try and grab him. With the aid of the Kaiser Chiefs and a plasma ball, Ben manages to spook the beast into a retreat, albeit to receive a bollocking from his mum on the destruction caused to their house. In the forest, Abby and Cutter's team converge, as all of them stumble across another Permian giant. Nick identifies it as a type of anapsid, which are vertebrates that lack skull openings near the temple like tortoises, as Abby points out. The exact creature is a Scutosaurus, another late Permian reptile, albeit this time from Siberia, but still an animal, and Abby tells them to stay in its field of vision to prevent it panicking. They were rhino-sized in real life, but considerably larger and more elephant-sized in Primeval. The team also find Rex, and survey the damage done by the therapsid to Ben's room. He tells them about the anomaly, although the adults play it cool and play it off as childish imaginations, and that Rex is indeed a Draco Volans. At the Scutosaurus, Connor believes it'll win him a Nobel Prize, although what exactly he thinks it'll contribute to physics, chemistry, physiology, literature, world peace, or economic science is unknown. Nick returns and intentionally startles it, hoping to prompt it to return back to where it initially came from, and sure enough, it flees back through the anomaly. Many animals do have some form of homing instinct, and this is why in some cases reintroduced animals need a soft release before being set free, due to the fact they'll return home, even over hundreds of kilometers, if not. The anomaly has an immensely strong magnetic field, and such a field can play a key part in animal navigation. It's how birds orient themselves on migrations, and can be used in foraging for other vertebrates like foxes too. So most creatures that come through an anomaly probably don't stray too far from it, unless they get trapped and can no longer sense it. Stephen accurately predicts that Cutter is now thinking about Helen, and he's certain she went through one. Claudia also ropes Nick and Abby into getting back to her office to sign the Official Secrets Act, and we also meet her boss, James Lester. James says, "I don't like civilians in these sorts of situations," and with everything we see of him in the series, it's unclear why he felt the need to add anything after the first 3 words. Nick fills Lester in on his theory as to what the anomalies are: fault lines in time and space that allow physical beings to pass through. He wants to get back into action and not to sign indemnity forms in an office. And after a chaotic biometric session monitoring Rex, Lester agrees to grant Cutter an exploratory mission into the anomaly. Back in the forest, Connor and Stephen track down the remaining insurgent from the anomaly. Connor believes it to be a Gorgonopsid, and it tracks Ben to his school, with Stephen tracking the Gorgonopsid there as well. A chase ensues and he saves Ben and his teacher from getting eaten, albeit at the cost of cornering himself. Stephen grabs the fire extinguisher as a weapon, and blinded and confused by the spray, the Gorgonopsid rams free from the doors and flees, knocking Stephen unconscious in the process. Whilst Gorgonopsid is a vague and nebulous term for a large family of later Permian animals, the one in question is likely in Ostracevia, the largest of the family and from Permian Russia, being a possible contemporary of Scutosaurus, and often depicted hunting them in paleoart and media. In Ostracevia was around the size of a large brown bear, and with more sprawling limbs, not quite the truck-sized dino wolf of the series. Regardless of size, the entire family were potent top predators of the late Permian, and Primeval's giant specimen is no different in that regard. Cutter readies for his trip through the anomaly. He gets paired with Captain Tom Ryan, fresh from Operation Desert Storm. Both Abby and Claudia seem a little cautious about Nick going through, with the latter instructing Ryan to bring him back no matter what. On the other side, the two were greeted by the same vast volcanic landscape Ben saw earlier. The two now see herds of Scutosaurus, and Cutter sets Rex free. On the other side, the magnetic field starts to weaken. Ryan permits Cutter an hour on his own of their allotted 2, and despite Cutter's wanderer over a sea of fog attempts, he finds nothing of Helen. Ryan might have though, and finds what he later accurately describes as a military camp. There's a male corpse, now just bone, sank into the soil, and Helen's camera. Nick's tunnel vision increases with the first sign of his wife in 8 years, and he claims he's staying. Ryan follows his orders and knocks him unconscious, carrying him back to the anomaly. Nick refuses to leave, and Ryan decides to appeal to Cutter's humanity with the deal of you stay, I stay, as the anomaly starts to close. Cutter begrudgingly permits, and the two return to the present along with Rex, unknown to the team except for Abby. The reunion is interrupted by the Gorgonopsid crashing through the camp. Everyone flees in every direction, and the Predator winds up focusing on Claudia after she trips. Steven arrives and rams it down with their Hilux, before finishing it with gunfire. Intimidating as it may have been, the Gorgonopsid is pitiable in the end. It was shown waiting, presumably for some time, before its charge, and was likely panicked by the fact it couldn't sense the anomaly anymore. When it does attack, it's a directionless charge through the people, as it more seems to be trying to find the anomaly to try and return home. Through its time in the present, it did actually act cautiously, fleeing when exposed to new and unusual stimuli rather than doubling down on the attack. Overall, it was just trapped out of its time, and lashed out as any scared animal may. Back at the home offices, the film from the camera is developed, and Nick sees new images of his wife's face for the first time in 8 years. Lester is happy the anomaly is closed, but Nick is far from content to let things lie as he storms out. Working late in his office, Nick is reeling from the past few days' events. Now knowing his wife left him to explore the deep past with another man, likely has him questioning a great many things, such as if she's still alive, and how well he ever really knew his own wife. A dying ammonite is left on his desk, and Nick rushes outside to see what he thinks is Helen waiting for him. She vanishes before he can reach her, and now Nick is likely doubting his own mind too. Episode 2 opens with a glimpse of one of its monsters of the week, with a woman on the London Underground being snapped at by what appears to be a giant spider. Back on the surface, everyone is trying to process the events of the last few days. At uni, Connor tells his friends Duncan and Tom about the anomalies, and the animals that came through them, but obviously isn't allowed to say more or show proof, which goes down about as well as you'd expect, and neither believe him. In Cutter's office, he and Steven pore over Helen's old notes and published papers, now hoping to find some clue as to where she may have gone, or some reference to the anomalies. Although Nick leaves out Helen's little ammonite and gaslight stunt from earlier, if it really happened. Connor goes to visit Abby with his latest find from the Weird Sightings forum, in the hopes it can be his opportunity to prove himself to Cutter. Abby is pretty hesitant, until Connor also finds Rex in her apartment. With a little mild coercion, she agrees to go on his wild goose chase to the New Forest in search of a creature. Meanwhile, in the London Underground, a pest control worker is busy spraying the tunnels. He's near constantly flanked by the same species of giant spider-like invertebrate seen earlier, as they start picking off rats and then upgrade to a larger target. At the home office, Lester is already mouthing off about Cutter, and it's clear the two didn't have a great start, or are maintaining a good middle. Claudia defends Cutter though, and Lester notices it. She later visits Cutter in his office, and they talk about Helen. With their revelation of the anomalies, Cutter is starting to view things more and more as his fault for driving her away. They were disagreeing heavily on aspects of their work to the point of multiple rows, with the last time they saw one another being one such argument. Claudia tells him he's not to blame for her death, but Nick isn't so certain she's dead. In the New Forest, Connor and Abby chat as they wait for their creature. Abby blows off Connor's creeper moves and then asks him if he knows if Steven is seeing anyone, obliterating Connor's heart. Ironically, Connor was asking Steven similar things about Abby in the Forest of Dean last episode. Connor tries to suggest Stephen might be gay, and Abby leaves him on first watch. She also texts Stephen, as he rouses Claudia and Nick from their office to go and find them. Their monster turns out to be a hoax set up by Duncan and Tom, and Nick is furious. Not only does he drop Connor from their hastily assembled team, he drops him as a dissertation student as well. Abby only stays as she has skills relevant to what they're doing. The subway worker has been found, taken to hospital, and is severely envenomated. With no idea of what the toxin is, they have little hope of treating it, and there are claims he was babbling about monsters before he lost consciousness. An anomaly seems likely, so they persuade Lester to close a section of the underground where he was found, and they send Ryan and his men in. Things get haywire quickly when the giant invertebrates drop from the ceiling and attack, and from Ryan's description, the area under the tunnels now has an overabundance of oxygen, leading Nick to think the anomaly is from the Carboniferous period. Abby's newfound position working with invertebrates comes in handy, and she joins Nick and Stephen in the tunnels. Nick uses torches over guns in the tunnels, and this is likely due to the fact the giant spider-like creatures most resembled solifuges. Solifuge literally means to hide from the sun, and with a fearsome appearance, they're well known for being believed to chase people, when in reality they're just trying to get into the shade of their shadow. The invertebrates in the tunnels similarly don't like light. Presumably the spider-like creatures were initially based off Walking with Monsters' Megarachne, but more recent fossil evidence since then has found it was actually a giant sea scorpion, not a spidery creature. So Stephen's remark about them actually being closer to scorpions was sort of true. Happily though, solifuges as a family had first arose by at least the late Carboniferous, so with no explanation or name given in series, they can be described as giant primeval early solifuges. The three chase the last of the solifuges back and find their anomaly, but they find more than they bargained for too, and as well as the giant spider-like creatures, there's also a giant centipede-like one too. In the chaos of the ambush, Nick is isolated in an old work tunnel, and whilst trapped, he hears a ghostly woman's voice calling his name from the tunnels, and quickly assumes that it's Helen. Panicked on the surface, Claudia needs more information on whatever the giant centipede is, and is persuaded to bring Connor back. Whilst she's busy, Stephen sneaks back into the tunnels. He's ambushed again by the centipede, but fights it off with an old industrial flamethrower he finds. The second the anomaly snatches it away with its magnetic field, the beast lunges and Stephen is bitten. As he falls into fever-like symptoms from the neurotoxin, a blurred woman approaches him, but makes no move to help. Cutter finds Stephen though, and begins hauling Stephen to the surface. As he does so, he insists to Cutter that Helen is alive, and she's waiting with the truth on the other side of the anomaly. Claudia sends Ryan down to find them, and brings Connor back. Connor identifies it as most likely an arthroplurid, a giant prehistoric member of the myriapods, who were the family of long-leggy bugs. He correctly notes that the prevailing theories weren't depicting them as savage carnivores, but more herbivores, and that the fossil evidence suggests that Arthroplura were herbivorous detritivores. The one in the series much more resembles a giant Scolopendra, a genus of large venomous and carnivorous centipedes that are voracious predators, such as the fearsome tiger centipede. The 40-foot monster is a far cry from the 8-foot mildew eater of reality, but maybe it's a separate branch of Myriapoda. Show and reality may share some similarities though, and unlike the solifuges, the Arthroplura seemingly has little need to stick so close to the anomaly and the very high oxygen zone. Real-life Arthroplura achieved their massive size outside of the Carboniferous oxygen peaks, when oxygen was only 20% or so higher than today. This shared ability likely allows it to stray further and make more of a nuisance of itself. Nick brings Stephen to the surface, and Abby shoots a shot as he's hauled onto the ambulance. With nothing known about the Arthroplurid's venom, Stephen is doomed, and the pest controller has since died from the toxin too. Stephen's only chance now is getting the venom from the Arthroplura itself to try and synthesize an antivenom. Nick hatches a plan to goad the bug into biting him to gain said venom, but as they return to the tunnels, it looks like it's already left, until Connor finds its burrow. He, Nick, and Ryan crawl through to find it, and begin a confrontation with the Arthroplura. Cutter is successful in getting the venom sample, while Connor and Ryan engage with the centipede. Ryan wounds it before it snatches his gun, and Connor wedges a stool in its mandibles. Trying to shake it free, the Arthroplura instead fatally shocks itself on exposed machinery. The antivenom works, but Stephen has no memory of anything that happened, not of what he and Abby said to each other, but most importantly of seeing Helen. But Cutter accepts Connor back into the team, sans a cool nickname. Connor leaves delighted, and Nick continues to ponder the anomaly and if his wife is still alive. Episode 3 opens with a lifeguard and his girlfriend having some after-hours time at the pool. She goes off to dry her hair and get ready, while he goes for one final dive, and indeed a final everything, as out of nowhere a giant mosasaur lunges from the pool and consumes him whole. At the home office, Cutter regroups with Lester and Claudia. The underground anomaly remains active with no fluctuation, and is being monitored, showing the anomalies aren't all just the same. Cutter believes this isn't a new feature, and anomalies can explain historical claims of monsters and cryptids. He tries to be proactive and launch a clear plan to deal with the anomalies, but Lester cuts him off, and seems adamant to remain completely reactive to the anomalies instead. Stephen is ready to be discharged from hospital, and obliterates Abby's heart when he reveals he has a girlfriend who just got back from the rainforest, and who he hasn't seen in 2 years. Connor also tries to blag his iPod in the event of his death. At the pool in the daytime, the team show up to survey what happened, and Cutter is already concerned Diane, the lifeguard's girlfriend, may see prison time for erroneous murder, entrusting Claudia to see things through properly. Connor, Abby and Stephen monitor the pool and its water, and Connor points out the toxicity of chlorine to reptiles likely caused the mosasaur to flee relatively quickly, also just showing how short-term this particular anomaly was. Claudia confronts Lester, who is happy for Diane to be thrown in jail, and Claudia is furious about it. She gets Lester to begrudgingly drop the charges once the immediate crisis is over, even if that could result in a life-changing few months in prison. At a nearby reservoir, the same mosasaur reveals itself again, and it also spits out the lifeguard in a half-digested bolus, which is something mosasaurs were believed to do. Fleshy mammal pieces would likely go down a treat, but maybe it couldn't digest the swimming trunks. Unlike the chlorinated pool, fresh water is nothing to dissuade an oceanic mosasaur, with fossil evidence showing they routinely arrived at estuaries to drink fresh water every few weeks. So any that come through into a modern lake or river could likely stay for some time. This also suggests the anomaly's location is fixed in the past but mobile in the present. The team show up and Connor deduces the anomaly is still open from the water level in the reservoir, rapidly declining as it flows through the anomaly. Later, Cutter sees steam rising from a select point, and believes it to be warm Cretaceous seawater flooding in as the tide comes back in on the other side of the anomaly. He and Stephen get ready to join the divers to find the anomaly, as Abby and Connor collect more samples from the shore. Cutter and a diver find the anomaly, and the latter swims straight through. Meanwhile, the mosasaur finds Abby and Connor, and after a curious investigation, gives chase. The two are trapped on the shore as the reptile haws itself free to try and pursue them, trapping them against the fence. Connor bravely steps up and fights it with an oar, successfully stabbing it in the roof of its mouth with the broken wood. The mosasaur decides humans are more trouble than they're worth, and returns home to warmer waters through the anomaly, which closes near instantly after, trapping both it and the lost diver on the other side. Back at the home office, Cutter believes the point between the pool and the reservoir is a fault line, and that another anomaly could open at any point along it. Lester scoffs at this, and also doxes himself as a climate change denier, arguing that it's random chance. Moments later, another anomaly opens on Cutter's fault line in the basement of a house. At uni, Connor is busy reading up on mosasaurs, and meets Tom and Duncan again. Both are getting weirded out by his declining interest in their geek culture and lack of social availability, and decide to up their surveillance of him. Before heading to the flooded basement, Stephen starts to regain his memories. He now clearly remembers Helen, and brings it up to Cutter, who reveals he might have known Helen was about the anomalies earlier. But in Nick's defense, Helen only ever did so in cryptic and gaslighty fashion, that probably led Nick to doubt his own sanity rather than become certain his wife was still alive. Nick is decidedly bristly about it, and focuses on Helen's emotional neglect of him and literal neglect of Stephen, that she left him on the floor dying of a neurotoxin. Stephen then very passionately points out that if Helen were his wife, he'd go through 100 anomalies for her, and how much she meant to him too. Nick reminds Stephen that Helen was in fact his wife. At the anomaly site, a plumber is called in to fix what the homeowner thought was a leak, and he's attacked by a great naked bird, and the body of the diver floats back through the anomaly. The bird is later identified in episode as Hesperornis, and it isn't so far from how it was in real life, cumbersome on land but graceful in the water, unlikely fish eaters. Why one attacked the plumber is uncertain, as many oceanic seabirds when on land are often chill to the point of naivety. But some, like steamer ducks, will quite readily attack other birds, seemingly to practice for the main event of fighting another steamer duck. Or maybe the one that came through the anomaly was an unnaturally bold individual. Boldness and shyness are the two first measurable traits of animal personality, and reaction to new phenomena can often be a key distinguishing feature. Anything that passes through an anomaly is much more likely to be a significantly bolder than average individual, and so potentially more dangerous. This also likely explains why Rex takes to people so well, and why anomaly specimens can often be so meddlesome. The show Hesperornis is also naked, which is an odd and common choice of the 2000s, and the desire to make Hesperornis look as evil as possible, which is rectified in more recent depictions showing them as feathered, similar to their modern analogues like grebes, loons and cormorants. On the body is a monogrammed handkerchief, a gift from Helen's mad aunt who'd give them at every Christmas and birthday, and became a running joke between her and Nick. For the second time, Claudia is furious, this time with Nick and his withholding information from the rest of the group. Nick does try to argue that Helen is his wife, but his actions have vanished any sympathy and trust Claudia may have had for him. It turns out she also contacts Lester about it too, who arrives to the anomaly site and is keen to send Nick through to find Helen, and bring her back. If he refuses, he's off the anomaly project and an armed team will be used instead. Nick swims through the anomaly and arrives in a shallow cove. A flock of Hesperornis swim around him fishing, and in the skies pterosaurs call on the wing. Searching through the volcanic black sand beaches, he walks inland, and finds Helen, alive and well and waiting for him in a freshwater pool. Things are frosty and awkward between them. Nick asks why Helen didn't come back, and Helen reflects his question to ask him if he's annoyed that she didn't come back, or didn't share the secret of the anomalies. And ultimately, selfishness was her reason. Helen openly states she wasn't ready to share the anomalies as if she's their owner. Helen's actor, Juliette Aubrey, said she knew Nick and other people would just make her stay if she came back, and once enough time had passed, it was too big a deal to simply waltz back in from. Helen now wants company, to share this now with Nick and only Nick, but her pleas don't get her very far when she brushes off any suggestion of a real apology for 8 years of emotional turmoil. Aubrey also added that she essentially knew what she was doing with the ammonite, and that it was unapologetically taunting Nick. On the other side of the anomaly, an armed team begin to gear up, and Claudia evades any questions from the others. Things aren't getting better for Nick and Helen, and when Nick points out the potential destruction and real deaths caused by creature incursions, Helen handwaves this in a way to suggest she'd not lose any sleep if the entire human race went belly up. Show creator Tim Haynes mentioned that from her time in the past, Helen has seen wonders and then watched incredible species go extinct due to humanity's destructive actions, and her travels had made her misanthropic. Juliette Aubrey adds that she believes Helen now views herself as above other human beings too. Helen seems confused as to why her sociopathic social Darwinism failed to win Nick over, and he leaves her to return through the anomaly. As he gets close, a mosasaur attacks, Nick gets a successful shot with his harpoon to repel it briefly, but with his airline cut, no second harpoon, and on the brink of unconsciousness, he seems quite literally dead in the water, until a huge second adult mosasaur seizes the small one and drags it away to eat. This behaviour is pretty spot on. One mosasaur, Prognathodon, was found with 3 other mosasaurs in its stomach, with one of them being the same species that would make it true cannibalism, and not just interfamily cannibalism, which doesn't really count. The fossil record has other instances of intraspecific hostility that ended in larger mosasaurs eating smaller ones, much like their land-living relatives monitor lizards. It's hard to say what exactly Primeval's mosasaurs are, or are meant to be, as our understanding on what they look like has changed considerably since, and they were a large and diverse family from adults smaller than modern monitors and specialised shellfish eaters, to school bus-sized top predators of the deep. Primevals have ornamented faces and knobbly backs that make them look like giant feast lollies. But from size alone, either Tylosaurus or Hoffman's mosasaur seem like reasonable picks for a fossil analogue, the former also being an occasional eater of other mosasaurs. Nick is dragged back and resuscitated, and the second Claudia confirms from him that Helen was there, Ryan's men are deployed. Cutter wakes a short while later in time to see them bundle Helen into the back of a car, and the episode ends. Episode 4 opens with the threat of an anomaly on a housing estate, as a reptilian eye glares out from beneath a toilet seat. Meanwhile, Helen is escorted in the maximum security wing of the Home Office. Helen and Lester are prickly with one another. Helen doesn't really want to talk, and Lester is chomping at the bit to deploy the thumbscrews. Full stop, but also especially on Helen, as Claudia tries her best to play peacemaker between them. Luckily though, the beast of the housing estate happily turns out to be an escaped Burmese python from the flat upstairs. Claudia tries to appeal to Helen's humanity, and she claims she'll only talk if she can speak to Nick. When the two meet, things are still prickly. Helen believes Nick set her up, and wants him to release her, as if he has that sort of power. When this surprisingly doesn't work, Helen still doesn't try the carrot but rather a bigger stick, claiming a pride of Smilodon will intrude central London in the next few hours, and only she can stop them. Meanwhile, Connor has essentially invited himself into Abby's flat, and also essentially extorts a kiss to show off to his friends, which is something. Said friends Tom and Duncan have also put a tracker on Connor's bag, determined to find out at last what his secrets are. Although he does at least keep her secret with Rex when Stephen comes to collect them both for Helen's Smilodon hunt. The whole squad assembles at a football stadium for the pursuit, and narrows their search to the stadium kitchens. Sure enough, behind the metal doors is an anomaly, but no current sign of the big cats. At the first chance Helen gets, she legs it through the anomaly. Stephen and Ryan follow in hot pursuit, but it's clear why Helen picked this particular anomaly. On the other side there are a dozen more, the Spaghetti Junction as they put it, for her to flee into. And no Smilodon. Yet. But rather another classic symbol of prehistoric fauna comes through, and a flock of rambunctious dodos storm the anomaly. In the chaos, one eats Connor's tracker and then manages to escape unseen. The rest are rounded up to the delight of the team, and are successfully sent back through the anomaly. The Spaghetti Junction didn't look like modern Mauritius, which is a well-forested island, so hopefully they all made it back through to their primary anomaly. Sadly though, the expedition seemed too much for one of the dodos, and it died in the kitchen. Cutter is surprised, in the belief that the anomalies aren't that taxing an experience, but Stephen rightly points out for all they know there could be hidden side effects they just aren't seeing yet. The kidnapped dodo is having some side effects of its own right now, both being sick at Tom and Duncan's flat, as well as showing bouts of extreme aggression and photophobia, destroying their television. Tom is hooked on the idea they'll make millions from the dodo somehow, and ignores such symptoms, until it undergoes another bout of hostility and bites him. At the lab, as they prepare the dodo for autopsy, a giant worm crawls out of its mouth and attempts to pursue Abby before dying quickly on the floor. Nick identifies it as a giant cestoid, better known as the tapeworm family. But there are some key differences. Tapeworms as a family are great at being parasites, but not much else. They can barely move and just sit in your intestine all day. Their bodies are broken up into proglottids, which are the body segments that are filled with eggs, unlike the primeval cestoid, which has a single body only partially segmented. The primeval cestoid can actually move with some real competency, both in the body and out, and it also seems to occupy the bodily cavity over the digestive tract. This is not like a true tapeworm, which are Eucestoda, but could be more like the Cestodaria, which are still cestoids but rather have true soft bodies, without segmented proglottids, and also inhabit the bodily cavity rather than the digestive tract too. It'd also especially be like a trematode or fluke, which are the closest relatives to cestoids as well. Trematodes have a layer of muscle beneath their skin, so they can move through the organs they live in too, much like the parasite does. Cutter also describes the condition the parasite left the dodo in, saying it destroyed most of the internal organs and also damaged the central nervous system too. This is bizarre. As Lester points out, most parasites don't want to kill their host, but it could be the cestoid attacks the nervous system to prevent proper muscular actions from getting rid of the eggs, much like how rabies causes muscular paralysis of the throat and adjacent areas, preventing the swallowing of saliva and spreading the virus via bite. The parasite presumably does something similar as it moves up the bodily cavity to the trachea to lay eggs that are carried by saliva for a fresh bite. After the larvae are passed into the bloodstream, they seem to arrive in the stomach and then eat the internal organs and rapidly grow as they move towards the trachea. Presumably, this causes the initial sickness seen in both Tom and the dodos, as they first try to shift the parasite mass in their stomach, or in response to it damaging the digestive tract. This seems like a really rapid life cycle for something with 100% fatality, that also infects large-bodied organisms, killing 2 dodos and 1, possibly 2 humans in the span of 12 hours or so. Maybe it isn't a dodo native parasite. Cestodaria are chiefly found in fish and marine life. Maybe it's used to huge shoals of fish. Or maybe marine sea turtles, whose slower pace of life also affects the speed of parasite growth. The warm blood and fast metabolism of dodos and humans kicked the parasite's life cycle into overdrive, and caused hyperspeed maturation. Or of course, something else infected the dodos from another anomaly. Cestoids are an ancient group, dating back to the Permian era themselves in marine life like sharks. Maybe a non-avian dinosaur gave the avian dinosaurs something they shouldn't have. Or of course, it could have come from a future anomaly too. Back at the flat, neither Tom nor the dodo are in great shape. Tom's arm discolors where the dodo bit him as the larvae move through the bloodstream, and the dodo attacks the bedroom light bulb and tries to go for Duncan as both its photophobia and aggression ramp up. As do Tom's, and he also tries to bite Duncan. A panicked Duncan tells Connor, who alerts the rest of the group. They go to the flat and their dodo is already dead, with Tom nowhere to be found. Tom tried to go to the doctors, but rushes to the toilet from a combination of nausea and photophobia. Whilst looking in the mirror, he sees the parasite, crawling its way up the bodily cavity to his throat. The MRI technician tries to schedule him for emergency surgery, but Tom bites the doctor and flees. Tom becomes increasingly paranoid, believing big government is using the general public as carriers for mind control or something. Despite Duncan and Connor's attempts to locate him, he flees. Cutter, Claudia and Stephen visit the hospital shortly after, but other than telling the doctor to get the parasite surgically removed, they get little info. Cutter points out that Tom isn't just an animal. The parasite causes behavioural changes of aggression to bite new hosts, and such behavioural changes in actual parasites are well known. Horsehair worms can seemingly cause insects to fling themselves into bodies of water for them to reproduce themselves, and Toxoplasma gondii is well known to cause significant behavioural changes like greater risk-taking behaviour, by rewiring its host's brain in the hopes it'll get eaten by a cat. But Nick says Tom will try to fight it, and that may give them an important advantage in preventing a pandemic. Nick believes Helen won't unleash this on them, but both Lester and Claudia are not at all convinced, and aren't afraid to show it. Tom has followed Abby via the tracker in the dodo, and finds her in Cutter's lab. And Cutter is right. Despite his paranoia and insistence on conspiracy theories, he still claims he doesn't want to hurt Abby and warns her to stay away. The rest of the team find out what's gone on from Duncan and set off to find them. At the lab, Tom refuses to listen to what Abby is actually saying, remaining insistent on his crackhead theories. He threatens to bite, and Abby plays along in the hopes of buying herself some time, taking Tom back to the stadium in the hopes of showing him the anomaly, and finally getting him to understand. Unfortunately, the anomaly has closed, and Abby now has no proof to show Tom, who loses his mind and attacks. A chase ensues with Tom finally capturing Abby in the stadium as the rest of the team catch up. Ryan and his men prepare to shoot, but Connor appeals to Tom's humanity, reminding him of undergrad nights of pizza and sci-fi marathons, and manages to get him to let Abby go. In his final moments, he humours a sick friend's delusions, affirming his beliefs of mind control on the dark side, and acclaiming his ability in fighting them off as Tom dies in his arms. A distraught Connor tries to leave, and this time Nick convinces him to stay, arguing this is the exact thing Tom would have wanted him to do. Connor agrees, and the two hug it out. A month or so later, on a warm spring day, we see Tiger Woods in action. As two friends have a long and unsuccessful day golfing, one storms ahead in the golf cart and loses his ball again, cutting himself on a thorn in the woods as he does so. Emerging back onto the greens, an aerial menace descends on him. He tries to flee, but is lifted from the ground and torn apart, with his friend finding his remains. Arriving at the scene, Claudia warns Cutter of Lester's growing impatience, but Cutter is initially skeptical this even is an anomaly, until he sees the body, and notes how precisely the flesh has been stripped from the bone. He summons the rest of the team, rousing Connor from his Oblivion marathon at Abby's flat, with Rex joining unbeknownst to him. Cutter, Steven and Abby try to find the anomaly, and realise it's 40 foot above them in the sky. As Cutter muses what could have come through, a giant pterosaur dive-bombs them and flies away, circling the course. As Connor arrives, Rex quickly escapes, and Connor gives pursuit, winding up on the greens in front of Nick and the others, where the pterosaur sees them both, begins to descend, and the chase begins. Nick calls Claudia and Ryan over, and Claudia insists Ryan shoot the pterosaur, believing it to be after Connor. Nick identifies it as a Pteranodon, albeit a really big one, and doesn't believe it to be what killed the golfer, or is after Connor. He mentions the fossil record has Pteranodon noted as a fish-eater, and is insistent it isn't going after man-flesh, even to the point of shoving Ryan and making him miss his shot. Connor and Rex dive into a bunker to escape the Pteranodon as it lunges for the latter. Back up the hill, Nick sees Rex, and Abby admits she kept him after the first anomaly. Claudia goes off her nut at this, and her and Nick have a domestic in front of the kids. But Nick does let Abby keep Rex. They use satellite imagery to find where the pterosaur is roosting, and two vehicles head into the city to apprehend it, with a clear and unspoken message that if Ryan gets there first, it's dead. Nick, Steven and Claudia arrive first, and Nick manages to persuade Claudia to let them have a shot at tranquilizing it first. The crest in Pteranodon is much more pronounced in certain specimens, ones that also have more narrow pelvises, with the belief that wider ones indicate egg-laying. So it seems the males likely had larger and flashier crests to attract females, much as some birds do, as there seems to be little other practical function for such a device in a pterosaur. Using Steven's red shirt to attract the pterosaur with the colour of either a mate or a rival, they lure it in so Steven can get an accurate shot. He cuts it pretty close, which is the correct procedure when shooting a charging animal, albeit perhaps not tranquilizing it, and it makes a crash landing on their rooftop, knocking Claudia unconscious after she loses her last straw with Cutter. Back at the stately hotel that the team are using as a field base, Claudia wakes up and punctures her blood bag. Being seen to by the medic, he deems there's no lasting injury, and takes both the spent oxygen tank and ruined blood bag back out to the ambulance. But Claudia then confesses to Nick she now can't see anything. In the woods, Connor and Abby find Rex, who's cowering beneath a fallen tree. A large flock of small, bat-like pterosaurs rest, Disturbed by the two, one of them scents the air and rouses the rest of the flock, who then take off and flood through the woodland. Stephen is with the larger pterosaur, and after examining its dung, exonerates it of killing the golfer. He rings Nick to let him know, and they now realise there's still the initial aerial predator on the loose to worry about. No sooner have they reached this conclusion, the flock descends on the medic outside with the scent of the blood bag, and devour him. The pterosaurs were identified non-diegetically as Gnuregnathus, a small and early Jurassic pterosaur of Walking with Dinosaurs fame. And the sky piranhas angle is another speculative suggestion of Tim Haynes, who in Walking with Dinosaurs featured them as oxpecker analogues on sauropods. In reality, Gnuregnathus were small and bristly insectivores who would have looked a lot like a bat, with their coat of integument. They would have behaved a lot like bats too, with the chief suggestion being with their large eyes. They may have been nocturnal and functioned like pterosaur nightjars or bats, hunting insects on the wing in low-light conditions. Some have even suggested they had sensory pits in the jaw, possibly having whisker-like attachments like certain nightjar feathers, that are sensitive to prey movements at night, though this latter point has not been met with widespread approval. For this very speculative take though, maybe piranhas are an apt comparison. Far from their supervillain aiding reputation of devouring anything that enters their water, piranhas typically hunt smaller fish than themselves. They will readily take carrion though, and dramatic tales of them stripping things to the bone likely only occur when floodwaters wash carcasses into their pools, and piranhas consume the already dead flesh. Or alternatively, if carrion enters pools in the dry season, when piranhas may be struggling nutritionally. Primeval's Gnuregnathus may have lived as scavengers on the giant sauropods of the era, which would provide a banquet of carrion to sustain many large flocks, who, as volant animals, would be better equipped to access them than the large terrestrial theropods of the region. Arguably, we see the genesis of this idea in Haynes' earlier documentary, The Ballad of Big Al, where Gnuregnathus in the series show up to feast on the bodies of dinosaurs trapped in the mud wallow. Perhaps that's where the initial thought came from. The Pteranodons may normally live as either small prey predators or in large scavenging flocks, only becoming swarming shoals in the Holocene due to a lack of food. In the opening, we see at least one ungulate carcass the language of television says was eaten by the flock too. And Nick also notes earlier there's no birdsong. Rather than the Pteranodons scaring them, it's more likely they were eaten by the flock in the immediate area too. Gnuregnathus were from the Jurassic, unlike the late Cretaceous Pteranodon. But from those 2 points it does seem possible they arrived via a different anomaly several days earlier than the Pteranodon, who had only arrived shortly before its discovery, and also hadn't strayed very far from the anomaly side too. The idea of piranhas of the sky did make some waves in fiction as well, and the year after, in season 4 of the revived Doctor Who, Stephen Moffat created the Vashta-Narada, microscopic scavengers that lived and bred in trees, with the Doctor literally describing them as piranhas of the air.
Man-eating swarm. The piranhas of the air.
In the 2-parter episode, that's an inferior version of his Empty Child and the Doctor Dances, they reach hyperabundance on a library planet due to them hatching en masse from the wood pulp used to make books, skeletonizing the entire populace and anyone else who landed on it. Although in the next season of Primeval, Tim Haynes also helped himself to the Weeping Angel light flicker shot gimmick from Moffat's episode Blink, when they were actually cool. So there was plenty borrowing going round in televised UK sci-fi at the time. Nick locks down the hotel and tries to summon help, but one of the pterosaurs gnaws through the phone line. Trying to find a phone, this was 2007 by the way, he hides Claudia in a room, but not before kissing her, as the swarm smashes through both the bay and ceiling windows, before Nick makes it to the ambulance where he's trapped. In the hotel, one of the swarm manages to make it down the chimney. It calls the rest of the flock before harassing Claudia, who does her best to defend herself with a golf club. Out of nowhere, Helen intervenes and saves her, trapping the Gnuregnathus in a kitchen with the gas on, before using the microwave to create a spark and ignite the room, blasting them all to Kingdom Come. As things get wrapped up, Abby lets Connor stay with her permanently, and they prepare the Pteranodon for takeoff. After a quick victory lap of the golf course, it's lured back to the anomaly by homing instinct and a literal red flag, just before it closes, and the team celebrate a job well done. Sometime later in episode 6, Claudia interrupts Nick in a game of office golf. Nick tries to persuade Claudia that he's an open book, and then swerves the first question when Claudia asks if he still loves Helen. The two then chat about the anomalies, and Nick still wants to be more predictive, claiming he has a theory on how they could potentially predict them. Claudia also brings up that Nick kissed her, and jokes about sexual harassment, which is a bit rich considering her first interaction with him. In the Forest of Dean, the Permian anomaly reopens. Something tears through the gate set up, but later examination shows there's no track or sign of anything coming through, and the team assume whatever it was must have gone back through. But at Wellington Zoo, a strange creature starts to patrol the grounds, breaking into the lion exhibit and snatching one of the males. Meanwhile, in a really 2007 scene, Abby is teaching Connor how to speak to women, and chastises him for bringing up Marvel on the first date. Oh, Connor, give it 15 years. The two get called into the zoo on business when Abby is notified the lion is missing. Connor spots some blood and takes a sample, both suspecting it might be an incursion with the missing lion. Meanwhile, Helen shows up at uni and starts rattling off her Joe Rogan doomsday prepper paleo BS about how soft humans are now to Steven, who asks what she really wants. Helen demands a meeting with Nick and Lester, citing the disappearance of 3 people in the past 24 hours, and that she knows what's taking them. She then also essentially calls Steven a himbo and kisses him on the lips, which isn't how a student supervisor one-on-one should go. Back at the zoo, Abby is feeding the elephants, and something watches her from afar. We see through its senses, and it seems to track the heartbeat and other vibrations of its target, with the low frequencies generated by the elephants disturbing or unnerving it, and causing it to retreat. Instead, it heads to the elephant house, and starts stalking Abby's boss, Tim, and we get our first real look at it. Slate grey and ape-like in proportion, with slender digitigrade limbs, a hunched back and bulbous head. At the home office, Connor mentions the analysis of the blood sample came back, mainly lion, but also some bat. Abby disregards this, as a zoo is full of places that could hold a small colony of pipistrelles. But Connor insists the DNA was abnormal. Abby also has bigger things to worry about now, her boss now being a missing person. Lester agrees to Helen's demand, but also makes his skepticism clear that Helen may be up to something. Lester, Cutter, Steven and Claudia meet Helen, who informs them about the creature that's responsible for the missing persons. Helen reveals the creature is from the future, and is a remarkable ambush predator with incredible agility and considerable cunning. Helen never actually saw the future anomaly, rather encountering the creature in the Permian where it must have come through a deep future anomaly. Upon returning, it was apparently all she could do to help, and in a surprising swerve, she tells Lester she can now be found at her house with Nick. At home, Nick tells her to come clean about her reasons, and Helen admits the predator followed her back through the Permian anomaly, and makes this somewhat her fault. Helen argues that she's stayed to help, and does still care, even about Nick too. Connor mentions the weird bat blood and missing people and animals from the zoo to Steven when they discuss Helen's news. Steven rushes to the zoo and tells Connor to bring backup. He finds Abby in the sea lion tunnel, when the creature finds them too, and we finally see it clearly. With its hunched back, reduced eyes, and seemingly using echolocation to see the world around it. Distracted by the vocalizing sea lions, it seems to struggle to detect Abby and Steven until backup arrives, and it flees. Helen tells Claudia if they want to find its lair, they'll need dogs. The two also talk about Helen saving Claudia, and Helen implies she was watching the whole thing, possibly including the kiss. She starts probing Claudia about their relationship, who gets defensive, and Helen does seem to still view Nick as her husband, despite that whole 8-year emancipation thing. Cutter, Ryan, Steven and Connor assemble a dog team, and begin to search the area around the woods for the creature. The dogs become restless and a soldier is grabbed, with Cutter seeing the creature leaping between the trees as it flees again. The team realise the creature is using sound, and the dogs were capable of detecting the frequency the creature uses to echolocate. They deduce this future predator is likely some derived bat. Interestingly, in an interview, Tim Haynes mentioned that they arose from an extinction of primate species, rather than carnivorans, which with the other features may suggest a natural tropical home for them, which explains their preference for arboreal movement. For a full breakdown of its speculative ecology, be sure to check out my video on the future predator itself after you finish this one too. Some of that may also explain the elephants earlier as well. Whilst Abby was feeding them, they did also cluster around her and prevent an ambush. Elephants have remarkable hearing and audio detection capabilities through their feet as well, and could have almost certainly detected the creature even if they had no prior experience with it. Even if they don't really know what they are, future series do also establish proboscideans react with hostility to future predators as well. Connor rushes to grab an oscilloscope, and is attacked in the car. Abby saves Connor, who is then also saved by Stephen, who shoots the predator in the shoulder and forces it to flee. Connor then has a bonding moment with Abby and Cutter, who even makes a Star Wars reference for him. Everyone then uses the dogs to find the predator's lair, and find it's given birth to 5 pups, having the bodies stashed nearby as food. A parent returns to protect the young, and Cutter grabs one of the pups and runs. The adult pursues him to a greenhouse, where he uses a mix of gunfire and smashing glass to confuse the predator's echolocation, before putting a round through its skull. Helen wants to use the pups to find the future anomaly in the Permian, with the claims that their homing instinct should lead them to it, which is a flawed argument as they were born in Anthropocene England and never knew their native era. But Nick considers the threat great enough to warrant a permanent intrusion into the Permian, to set up a guard over the future anomaly and prevent future animals messing with their timeline. Claudia is having bad dreams. She mentions it to Nick earlier in the episode, and we also see her have a dream of the Gorgonopsid in the offices, and now she also hallucinates herself fracturing into an anomaly in the bathroom mirror. This is fair, as the Gorgonopsid did single her out in the first episode, and then recently she was knocked unconscious by one pterosaur and then almost eaten by a flock of other ones. A little PTSD is expected from such stressful stimuli. But it is also worth noting Primeval isn't just our world, it's our world with anomalies. A world where, since the Carboniferous at least, there have been permanent and long-term gateways between time periods. Anomalies could be more inert than initially feared, with even long-term ones not really offering much stimuli to attract animals. But they could also facilitate gene, pathogen and nutrient flow in major ways that could cause sweeping changes that may also explain some of the less accurate creatures from the past. Or, even if localized, anomalies could result in certain instinctive behaviors in certain animals, either attraction or more likely deterrent, from certain stimuli like magnetic fields. This could be true of people as well. Anatomically modern humans may not have much reason to go through an anomaly, outside of curiosity and exploration, and ones prior to modernization may instinctively fear them due to the fact they provide much more chance of risk than reward. But if this is the case, then it's odd only Claudia feels this way. With events later in the episode, there may be circumstances relating to time travel with no real analogue, and Claudia's paranoia is a final and possibly terminal symptom of her ultimate fate. At the Cutter household, things are frosty. Helen tries to make a move on Nick, and he's not very receptive. The next day, the team readies for their Permian exploration. Claudia makes a final attempt to get Nick to stay, curiously saying she has a really bad feeling about the whole thing. Nick goes anyway, and before he leaves, Claudia goes in for a kiss, and now Nick is very receptive, with full reciprocation from both parties in front of everyone, including Helen. Claudia's actress Lucy Brown claims there was something between them essentially at first sight, and from Claudia's first kiss, with Claudia being initially physically attracted to Nick, and then falling for him full time due to his intellect and passion. Other characters like Lester and Helen do seem to pick up on it as well. On the other side of the anomaly, Helen believes it was to punish her, and Nick reminds her the whole world doesn't actually revolve around her. The autopsy of the future predator is done, and the lab rings Connor with the results. The creature was without doubt a male, looking after the young. The team quickly conclude the mother is still out there, and unknown to the team, she leaps through the anomaly and tears across the lava fields after her young. As the Permian team set up their camp, Nick takes a few holiday snaps of Helen, and now everything falls into place for him. The camp they found in their first incursion wasn't Helen's, it's theirs, and Ryan was right about it being a military camp. They've created their own past, and there was a body. The predator pups go haywire, and Helen believes they're near the anomaly. Nick deduces Helen just wanted to use them to explore the future for herself, and when she attempts to go in for her own kiss, he coldly rebuffs her. The real reason the pups started calling was the arrival of their mother, who quickly massacres Ryan and his men. As she turns her attention to Nick, a Gorgonopsid arrives, drawn by the commotion. The mother predator identifies the most severe threat, and the Gorgonopsid is quickly incensed by a foreign competitor in its territory. Past and future collide as the two fly into combat, with the Gorgonopsid dominating in round 1 as it headbutts the mother into unconsciousness. As Nick tries to tend to Ryan, the Gorgonopsid turns its attention to the squealing predator pups, and starts eating the litter. The mother regains consciousness and launches a surprise attack, with a brief and brutal fight occurring. It's a classic display of speed versus power, with the future predator inflicting many cuts and gashes, but ultimately being crushed by the Gorgonopsid when it seizes her arm and flattens her. The Gorgonopsid bellows its victory and carries her corpse away to eat in peace. Ryan's wounds are fatal, and he correctly deduces that simultaneously several months ago and several years into the future, he dug up his own skeleton in the Permian. Nick declares an end to things, and he and Helen bury Ryan and his men. Helen makes a last-ditch attempt to float the idea of Nick joining her on an anomaly mission, but he rebuffs her and her bitterness about Claudia. The two leave for the anomaly, but unknown to them, a pair of the predator pups survived the encounter. Arriving back in the future, Cutter informs the team of what happened. Helen isn't finished though, and decides if Nick gets his own new love interest, then she can rekindle one of hers, and smugly reveals she had an affair with Stephen, announcing he once said he'd do anything for her. She invites him to come along, now Nick's rejected her. An ashamed Stephen tells her that she can be a real bitch, and elects to stay in the present. Helen decides to lump her double rejection and leaves. Nick asks where Claudia is, but the entire team doesn't recognize anyone by that name, genuinely seeming shocked when Nick gets stressed that no one seems to know who she is. He realizes something has gone severely wrong in the past, and the anomaly begins to flicker behind him. This was my first time actually rewatching Series 1 of Primeval in its entirety in a very long time, and I was really pleased by how well it holds up. I'd forgotten how good a lot of the performances are, especially Nick, Helen and Claudia's actors in particular. The writing for those characters in the first season at least is generally pretty solid. Not award-winning, but good enough, and typically revolving around the aforementioned characters, as those are the ones with the most prevalent and story-relevant arcs. I also think Ben Miller and Juliet Aubrey have phenomenal chemistry together. It's a bit of a shame they didn't get 1 or 2 more scenes in this season. Aubrey's way of playing Helen as greedy, needy, yet simultaneously distant, I thought was a really nuanced performance. How she was constantly seemingly dependent on, yet failing to, wheedle and persuade people she thought were beneath her, but without still going too far with the misanthropy or outright villainy. She always comes across as someone who can't quite believe anyone would disagree with her, and hasn't heard the word no in a very long time. 8 years even. Connor and Abby are probably the wonkiest characters in many ways, as they're very 2007, in a lot of ways that haven't aged especially well. Episode 4 is an emotional high point for the series, but also one of the worst in this regard too. Andrew Lee Potts is essentially playing the same character he did in BBC's peculiar attempt at making their own Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Strange, a few years earlier. Though I'm fairly certain I'm the only human being that remembers that programme. Outside of episode 2 and 6, Steven's character is also just sort of, I'm in this episode as well. And he doesn't get much of an arc until series 2. On a similar note, Primeval had to play its cards right, as it was essentially born already fighting against the popularity of revival Doctor Who. And whilst it did differentiate itself quickly and successfully, it does feel like the former had some influence. Nick Cutter does feel very Ninth Doctor coded, and whilst Douglas Henschel isn't necessarily an unconventional lead, the producers didn't seem to think so at least, the more stoic to grumpy persona is a less conventional choice, and a lot like Eccleston's Doctor early in his arc. Again, I think it's testament to Henschel that he makes Cutter so likeable because of his grumpiness, rather than in spite of it. The scene of him being handed a gun and asking for a torch instead is also very Doctor-coded, and it also sets up the seriousness of the future Predator later, with Nick both approving of guns, and then actually using one himself to personally plug the adult male. A lot like Russell T Davies era Doctor Who as well, I think Primeval really successfully juggles both a serialised multi-episode arc, with its individual Monster of the Week episodes without detracting from either. It really does manage to have its cake and eat it, and it was very refreshing to watch for that format too, as you never seem to get Monster of the Week in anything live action anymore, despite its validity and flexibility as a format. I think all the 6 episodes are quite solid, but 1 and 6 I'd say are the strongest, with episode 6 possibly being the best overall Primeval episode, that essentially plays every strength the show has in one. I think episode 2 is overall the weakest of the series, but doesn't really fumble anything major. The effects for the most part really hold up too. Some definitely look a lot better than others, and the spiders and Ignorognathus generally come up a bit short compared to the rest, which typically look fantastic. There's a lot of very successful blending of light and breaking of shadow where necessary too, as well as some good, weighty feeling animation. After several years of the Walking With series, Impossible Pictures were probably quite used to it. The future Predator looks especially good too, and the final fight with the Gorgonopsid really is nothing short of exceptional, with how fast, fluid and convincing the light and animation is. One thing to really note is how they both react to each other and how quickly. So many creature fights are very humanized, and can wind up feeling like professional wrestling, with them slowly reacting in shock and doing nothing to allow the opponent to enact some cinematic finishing move. In Primeval, the two are both trying to subjugate the other, while resisting the other's attempts at subjugation, but going berserk and repelling whenever they get grabbed, with barely a pause except for when they size each other up. The Gorg bucks like a radio bull to get the Predator off, while the Predator is all claws and limbs whenever it gets grabbed. It does end with a cinematic finishing move, but only because there was only ever going to be one outcome, with a huge strength disparity. And the Predator is clearly trying to pull itself free, it's just not got the power to do so. It all feels so convincingly animalistic, and is really a gold standard for a creature showdown. Really one of the best live-action beast fights. Rewatching it too, it's also clear how much the film Predator influenced episode 6, with the same trait and shot similarity of having the Predator vision, and showing the threat via that and hiding the creature's reveal until later, as well as the scene in the forest. Series 1's roster is interesting. With the exception of Rex and the Dodos, all the species included received notable roles in Walking With as well, and I imagine it was purposeful by Tim Haynes to not have an actual dinosaur in the first series. I think the Gorgonopsid and Future Predator both made for suitable flagships for Series 1, / the greater series for the latter. From a texture map of the Gorgonopsid, it does seem like they may have initially used the Walking With monster's body when making it, before upgrading the show's specimen to a more mammalian and front-heavy build. Whilst no one was expecting Primeval to be a documentary, and it has received some good-natured ribbing for its massive and homicidal creatures, I do also like how they partially subvert that in the series too. Connor describes what Arthroplora was actually like. The one in the show is just an undiscovered and evil species. The Pteranodon is essentially fairly realistic, if absolutely massive, and instead it's the Ignorognathus who may as well be murderous spec piranha pterosaurs. And both the mosasaur and dodo are fairly legit for depictions of them at the time. Overall, Primeval is generally quite a one-of-a-kind show. It's still a very original breath of fresh air to rewatch. I guess you could argue the closest thing to it since has probably been Terra Nova, and that sucked of course. If nothing else, it will always remain a really fun little slice of dramatic paleo media that still works as an entertaining drama too. Thanks for watching, and as ever a huge thanks to my patrons: Bonecrusher Hyena, Toxic Wolf, The Superest Duper, Samburgo, Ksandam, Octavia of the Fifth Fleet, Nickname 3110, Erengar Steiny, Kieran McCarthy, Flyguns Archives, Hui Hui, Jabin, The Belted Horned Warbler, Big Man Blastoise, Nathan Cross, Tim Gojira, Teddy KGB, Waffle, Dapperaptor, Godzilla Prime 2, Original Username, Evilly, Howleth, Archosaur Queen, Tommy Choi, Jacob Wilcox, Seth Fake Last Name, Zeisir Dodekablos, and Bazugazu Bakuhatsu, who keep the channel going with their generosity. A link to the Patreon is provided in the description if you ever felt like signing up, and any amount is always appreciated. If this is your introduction to the channel, then be sure to check out the Future Predator and Mer videos too, as well as other speculative zoology videos like World of Kong. A big thanks to the Primeval site for their renders of their characters too. This video was actually harder to make than I initially expected. Series 1 is now close to 20 years old. As such, the original site and all its iterations and their information are all gone. It's hard to find not potato quality footage without paying for it, and there's little behind the scenes stuff like there is for more modern programs. Hopefully this video still wound up okay. I do like doing more narrative stuff, but it's always hard to know what's good and what's superfluous in such a video. As writing went, I also lumped some scenes and locations together, rather than jumping back and forth despite episode chronology. And originally I was planning something of a breakdown at the end, that I decided would be better for Series 2's video whenever I get round to that. I also tried to write this for people who maybe hadn't seen the series, to try and keep certain things hidden, although I'm not sure how much of the audience that'll actually be, and why they didn't watch it before this after the first part of the recap. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed it, and do let me know what you thought in the comments. The next video should hopefully be the remastered Primal Season 1 video, so fingers crossed for that.